The tweet was still up when Marcus called me at 7 in the morning. He did not say hello. He just said, "Have you seen her Twitter?" And something in the way he said it made me put down my coffee and pick up my phone before he finished the sentence. I had spent our 5th anniversary alone in the restaurant we had booked 4 months in advance. Table by the window. The one she had specifically asked for because she said the city looked beautiful from that corner at night. I had sat there for 40 minutes with 2 menus and a bread basket, and a waiter who kept coming back and then stopping himself and then coming back again because he could see what was happening and did not know what to do about it either. I had called her 3 times, texted twice. The calls went to voicemail. The text showed delivered and then nothing. At some point I ordered food because sitting at a table in a restaurant for 40 minutes without ordering anything felt worse than eating alone. I ate alone. I drove home. She was not there. I sat in our living room until midnight, and then I went to bed because there was nothing else to do and I was exhausted in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. She came home at 2 in the morning. I heard the door. I heard her moving through the house. I did not get up. I told myself I was giving her space to explain in her own time. The truer reason was that I did not know which version of myself was going to stand up and walk into that kitchen, and I needed a little longer to figure that out. In the morning, she was already awake when I came downstairs. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and her phone, and she looked at me with the expression of someone who has been rehearsing something. I sat down across from her and waited. She said she was sorry about dinner. She said something had come up. I asked what had come up. She said a friend had needed her. I asked which friend. She looked at her coffee. She said his name, Ryan, her ex, the one she had dated for 2 years before we met. The one she had told me was completely in the past in the way people say things are in the past when they want you to stop asking about them. I said, Ryan needed you on our anniversary. She said it was not something she had planned. He had called, and he was going through something difficult, and she had felt she could not say no. I looked at her across the table and thought about 40 minutes with 2 menus and a waiter who kept stopping himself. I said, "You could not call me." She said she knew it looked bad. I said, "I am not talking about how it looks. I am talking about a phone call. One phone call at any point in the evening to tell me you were not coming." She said she had meant to, and then the time had gotten away from her. I said, 5 hours, Sophia. The time got away from you for 5 hours. She said she was sorry. I said I needed some air, and I picked up my keys and I left. I drove for about 20 minutes without going anywhere specific, and then Marcus called and said those words, and I pulled over and opened Twitter on my phone. Her account was not private. It had never been private because she used it for her work. She was a content strategist, and her online presence was part of her professional life. She had posted at 11:43 the previous night. I remember looking at the timestamp before I read the words because part of my brain was still trying to calculate how she had found time to tweet while not finding time to call me. The tweet said, "Showed up for someone who needed me tonight. No apologies for that. I don't owe anyone an explanation for choosing people over optics." There were 64 likes, 11 replies. 3 of the replies were from people I recognized, friends of hers who had commented with heart emojis, "And you are such a good person, and this is why I love you." She had liked all 3 of those replies. I sat in my car on the side of that road and read the tweet 4 times. I want to be precise about what it felt like because I have turned it over many times since, and I think precision matters here. It did not feel like anger first. It felt like a specific kind of disorientation that comes when something you thought was private turns out to have been a performance. She had not called me for 5 hours. She had found time to write a tweet. She had not explained anything to me. She had explained herself to 64 strangers and received heart emojis for it. And the word optics. She had used the word optics. As though my sitting alone at a restaurant on our anniversary was a matter of appearances rather than a marriage. I put my phone in my jacket pocket and sat for a while. Then I drove to Marcus's place because Marcus was the only person I knew who would not immediately tell me what I should feel about it and would just let me sit in his kitchen and drink his coffee and think. Marcus handed me a mug and sat across from me and said, "What are you going to do?" I said I did not know yet. He said, "Do you want my opinion?" I said, "Not yet." He nodded. We sat there for a while. He refilled my coffee without being asked. I said, "She tweeted it, Marcus." It was not a private text to a friend. She put it on the internet with the hashtag showing up for people. He said, "I saw." I said, "She has 300 contacts who can see that, including people we both know." He said, "I know." I said, She made me into the optics. He said nothing because there was nothing to add to that. I went home at noon. Sophia was in the living room. She had clearly been waiting. She had that quality of stillness that people have when they have been sitting somewhere for a long time working up to a moment. She started to speak, and I said, I saw the tweet. She stopped. I said, I want to understand something before we talk about anything else. You did not have 5 minutes to call me last night, but you had time to write a tweet and respond to comments. She said the tweet was different. I said, how? She said, it was just processing. It was just something I put out there. I said, you processed your evening on the internet before you talked to me about it. She said I was making it into something bigger than it was. I said, Sophia, look at me. Am I wrong that you called what happened between us last night optics? She looked at me and did not answer immediately, and that pause was the answer. I said, okay. I did not say anything else that afternoon. Not because I was punishing her with silence. Because I had genuinely run out of words, and I have learned that saying things when you have run out of words usually means saying the wrong ones. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall for a while. After some time, I heard her come to the doorway. She said, I know I hurt you. I said, yes. She said, I need you to understand that Ryan was in a really bad place last night. I said, I believe you. She said, I did not plan for it to be our anniversary. I said, I know you did not plan it. She said, then why does it feel like you have already decided something? I looked at her standing in the doorway. I said, I have not decided anything. I am trying to understand the difference between what you did and what you said about it afterward. Those are two different conversations. She said, what do you mean? I said, you missing dinner I can work through. I understand emergencies. I understand that people we care about have crises that do not check the calendar. What I am having a harder time with is that you described your choice to a public audience before you described it to me, and you used the word optics to describe my side of it. She opened her mouth. She closed it. I said, that word, optics. That is not how a person describes their husband waiting at a restaurant. She sat down on the chair by the window. She said quietly, I did not mean it like that. I said, then what did you mean? She said, I meant that I was not going to apologize for showing up for a friend just because it looked a certain way. I said, to who? Who were you explaining yourself to at 11:43 at night? Who was asking? She did not answer. I said, nobody was asking you to explain anything to the internet, Sophia. I was the only person you owed an explanation to, and I was asleep in our bed. She was quiet for a long time. I watched her sitting in the chair by the window where the late afternoon light came in and thought about how well I knew that face, and how sometimes knowing a face meant you could see the exact moment something landed in it. It landed. I could see it land. She said, I was not thinking about how it would seem to you. I said, I know. She said, that is worse, isn't it? I said, a little. Yes. She put her hands in her lap and looked at them. She said, I need to tell you something about last night. I said, all right. She said, Ryan did call me. He was going through something real. I am not making that up. I said, I believe you. She said, but I also. She stopped. She started again. I also knew when I saw his name on my phone that it was our anniversary, and I knew what it would mean to cancel. And I went anyway. And I told myself it was because he needed me, and that was true. But it was also another stop. I waited. She said, it was also easier than sitting across from you at a nice restaurant and talking about the fact that we have not been talking, really talking, in a long time. The room was very quiet. I looked at her by the window. She was looking at her hands. I said, say that again. She said, we have not been talking. Not really. For months. And dinner last night felt like this moment where it would all be there on the table, and I did not know how to. She shook her head. I said, you were afraid of dinner. She said, I was afraid of what dinner was going to be. The anniversary and the nice restaurant, and no more pretending things are fine. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor. I said, so Ryan called, and it was an exit. She said, it was not entirely. He did need help. I said, but it was also an exit. A long pause. She said, yes. I said, Sophia, you could have just talked to me. She said, I know that. I said, the thing you were afraid of. I have been afraid of it too. I have been sitting in this house for months knowing something was wrong and not starting the conversation because I thought if I started it, I would not be able to control where it went. She looked up. I said, I am not someone who is good at conversations I cannot control. She said, I know. I said, but I would rather have it than keep not having it. She said, even now? After all of this? I said, especially now. We sat in that room for 2 hours. Not the conversation we had been avoiding for months exactly, but the beginning of it, which is the hardest part. She told me things she had been carrying quietly. I told her things I had been converting into work stress and general silence. Some of it was hard to hear. Some of what I said was hard for her to hear. At one point she cried, and I sat beside her on the chair that was not quite big enough for 2 people, and she let me. At another point I said something about feeling like a supporting character in my own marriage, and she said, I feel that too. I feel like we stopped being each other's main thing. I said, when did that happen? She said, I think it happened slowly, and we both let it. At some point she picked up her phone and deleted the tweet. She did not tell me she was doing it. I saw her open the app, and I saw her find the tweet, and I saw her delete it and put her phone face down on the arm of the chair. I did not say anything about it. Some things do not need to be said. We did not fix everything in that room that afternoon. That is not how it works, and I knew that, and she knew that. But we started. Properly. Without the careful management that had replaced honesty somewhere along the way. She made dinner that evening, and I set the table, and we ate at home instead of a restaurant, and it was not our anniversary anymore, but it felt more like a marriage than anything we had done in a long time. She said at one point, I am going to call Ryan tomorrow and explain that I cannot be the person he calls for this anymore. I said, that is your choice. She said, I know. I am telling you because I want you to know I made it. I looked at her across the table. I said, okay. She said, okay. Later she said, I am sorry about the tweet. I said, which part? She said, the optics part. You were not optics. You were my husband sitting at a table waiting for me, and I made you into a concept to defend myself against, and that was wrong. I said, yes. She said, I am sorry. I said, I know. She said, that is it? I know. I said, I believe you. That is what I know means when I say it like that. She looked at me. She said, I forgot that about you. I said, which part? She said, that you mean things precisely. That I know does not just mean I know. It means something specific. I said, you used to know how to read it. She said, I used to know a lot of things about you that I stopped paying attention to. I said, we both stopped paying attention. She said, we should stop doing that. I said, yes, we should. Marcus texted me that night to ask how things were. I texted back 2 words. Still here. He sent back a thumbs up. That was the right response. Some things do not need more than that. I put my phone down and looked at the living room, at the house we had been living in parallel in for months without fully admitting it. And I thought about the restaurant and the 2 menus and the waiter who kept stopping himself. And I thought about how much can change in a single day if 2 people are willing to stop managing the distance between them and just sit in the same room and tell the truth. It is not a solution. It is a beginning. Beginnings are uncomfortable and imprecise, and they do not come with any guarantee. But they are still the only way anything gets better. We were beginning. That was enough for one day.